Hello and welcome. It is my honor and my pleasure to introduce tonight's main event, BHC President Stephen Mihm. I'm going to keep this short, both because Stephen doesn't really need an introduction, but also because he has a number of executive orders and plans to sign your address, which will completely change the way we do things at the BHC, including putting in laws that are going to change our standards and measures that we use. These are all going to violate our bylaws, which will make Vicky's head explode, but that's part of the fun. And he also plans to annex the Canadian Business History Association. The Canadians in the audience are getting up in arms over this, but we'll see how it goes. One reason that this is all going to happen is because when we elected Stephen as BHC president, what most of you probably didn't know is that he's actually the Russian oligarch. Now, this alter ego both explains his rash decision-making, but also explains his career path. With his intense focus on counterfeiting, including his deep dive into the origins of the Secret Service, his fascination with the original American con man, P.T. Barnum, and his obsession with crashing the U.S. economy, and then exporting that economic catastrophe around the world. In the ultimate oligarch move, he somehow convinced the New York Times that he should be the representative of the new history of capital. Now, of course, none of this really concerns Stephen, since he is a master survivalist with the ability to start fires on needed, build buildings, reconstruct World War II plane wreckage, and puree food. But of course, his most critical survivalist skill, and where he has made most of his billions as an oligarch, is in controlling Georgia's central market for apples. The next time you complain about the rising price of apples around the country, you now know who to blame. So, with no further ado, I want to introduce to you Stephen Mihm.
Knew about the resemblance, but it does make more sense now, doesn't it? All right. Well, thank you, Sharon, for a wonderful introduction. I want to thank all of you for coming, not only to this event, but also coming to the Business History Conference generally. It's wonderful to see us back at our prime levels in the past couple of years, and I'm thrilled to see everyone here. Before I begin, I want to make a couple public service announcements so that you can be aware of things that are on the horizon. First of all, I want to let you know that Mihm Olegario, our president-elect, will be presiding over an amazing conference in London, England. Right there. Co-creation is the theme, and that's going to be next March 26th through 28th. And then, not long after that, we have the World Congress of Business History, which is an event that happens periodically, in which the BHC is a sponsor. It involves a number of the other business history organizations around the world, and I strongly encourage you to go. It's going to be at the Rocket School of Management in Toronto. It'll be an amazing time. We just have to hope that geopolitical events allow us to go to Canada, given everything that is going on. Now, I also want to thank a number of people, and this is absolutely essential because as any past president of the BHC can attest, the success of the annual conference depends less on the person who plays my role than the many other individuals within the organization who give their time, in many cases their money, and in all cases, appropriately enough, given the theme, their labor, to sustain and support this event. And in this case, I've leaned on a very talented team of my fellow business historians to bring this event to life. Let me begin by acknowledging our BHC program committee. No? Okay. We have co-chairs Aya Sano and Grace Ballard, and then Ann Kristen Bergquist, Sean Bonata, Andrea Luch, Justine Hill-Edwards, and Bart Elmore, who is sporting a very fashionable-looking piece of hardware there. Bart also did double duty as chair of the Local Arrangements Committee, along with Keith Hollingsworth and Daly, Tim Yang, and Laura Phillips Sawyer. I want to recognize this because all of these two groups are responsible for everything that you see here, the amazing receptions, the walking tours, and so much more. And then there are two other individuals who are really key, for whom I have had to rely upon over and over. This is Roger Horowitz and our secretary, Vicki Howard, both of whom have been absolutely amazing in getting us across the finish line. And they were aided by three other individuals, in particular, Shane Hamilton, our sort of de facto and unofficial web administrator, Carol Lockman, whom you all know at the Hagley, and Paula de la Cruz Fernandez. I want to make sure you all welcome, and later on at the dance party, buy them a drink. Okay? All right. Now, for those of you who have attended a BHC presidential address, you know, as I definitely do, that the genre is a strange one. It is. For reasons that escape me, and it goes back deep in the tradition and history of our organization, presidents are expected to artfully weave their own personal history with an intellectual argument relating to the theme of the conference. And I can say with certainty that this is absolutely not an easy undertaking. Sharon and I were commiserating about this shortly, just a little while ago. But I want to thank my immediate predecessors, Dan Wadwani, Sharon Murphy, and Andrew Luch, for setting a very high bar and kind of pointing me in the direction of how to do this. All right. Let me begin by stating a point. Those of you who know me well, or know me as Roman Abramovich, have probably wondered why I, of all people, made the business of labor the theme of this year's conference. And frankly, you should wonder. I am not a labor historian. I am not a labor activist. In fact, I'm currently working in the academic equivalent of middle management, as a dean. And yet I've convened a conference dedicated to revisiting the labor question in our field of business history. And for that, I owe you an explanation. Now, it's very tempting to stand in front of you here tonight and claim the reason I'm doing this is I'm pushing a theme because it's a matter of making a cutting-edge historiographical intervention. And I'm bringing together business history and labor history because I believe that there's a strong intellectual argument for doing so. And I do think that is the case. But framing my decision thusly would be misleading and I think even disingenuous because it would absolve me of my own disengagement from labor history. And that is why what you will hear from me tonight is a little different maybe than what you were expecting. What you're going to hear from me tonight is less a manifesto than a meditation on why historians, particularly me in this case, study some things at the expense of others and how doing so can have real-world consequences. In my own case, it has blinded me from seeing a storm that began building many years ago here in the United States. That storm now rages, I'm afraid, at full force, lashing American institutions. Watching this unfold It's tempting to identify a single individual, the current occupant of the White House, as the reason. I would caution you about doing that, because that misses a very important point, that voters put this individual in the office. The majority of them did. Not just white voters, as is often assumed. I want to show you something from the recent election here in the United States. It should command your attention. The recent election turned primarily on a decisive shift of a specific cohort of voters, those making less than $50,000 a year. Members of this income bracket, or proxy for the working class here in the United States, went for the Republican Party for the first time in living memory. Note, too, a converse effect. For the first time ever, voters making more than $100,000 a year went as a majority for the Democrats. I'm not saying this to bring politics into this room. I'm saying this to point out a seismic shift, one that began in the wake of the Great Recession, gathering force and momentum in the 2010s. And I'm afraid that we are now at the point where the grievances of the working class, or in some cases the underclass, are difficult, if not impossible, to ignore. Moreover, while I will be talking about the United States, I'm afraid that this phenomenon is not a uniquely American one. All around the world, voters that look a lot like this, typically those without a college education, are gravitating toward authoritarian leaders. There is a robust academic literature on this phenomenon. It dates back to Seymour Martin Lipset's 1959 article, Study Democracy and Working Class Authoritarianism, which examined how economic hardship translates into political choice. Many scholars have elaborated and refined his thesis, for example, identifying that after 1989, the tendency was to shift toward the right rather than the left. That has been a more recent development. We historians often take our cue from current events. That's why, for example, the long-neglected field of financial history enjoyed a rebirth after the 2007 financial crisis. I'm afraid that what is happening now, I will not be surprised if our larger profession rediscovers the working class. And if that happens, our own field of business history has an important role to play. In proposing this, please know that I am following the lead of a handful of brave souls who have moved back and forth between business history and labor history for many years. This is not a complete list by any stretch of the imagination, but I want to give a shout out to Roger Horowitz, Phil Scranton, Walter Licht, or recently Jennifer Klein and Elizabeth Candy Shermer. There are others, but what is striking to me is that the idea of unifying business and labor history has yet to come to pass, despite the fact that 40 years ago, two scholars at this very conference made an argument for doing precisely that. Stephen Ross, labor historian, and Edwin Perkins, business historian, presented a conference paper that later became an article entitled Integrating Business History and Labor History. And it was greeted with mostly resounding silence. As far as I can tell, only two other academic publications ever cited it. My presidential address will be the third. However, I found the article very helpful in wrestling with this question of the relationship. And what struck me most was the author's joint observation, and listen carefully here, that the division between the two fields was the product of, quote, different ideological outlooks or intellectual concerns. Business historians tend to identify with capitalism and the play of the free market, with special emphasis on the role of entrepreneurship, whereas labor historians have generally expressed reservations about the impact of unrestrained competition upon less powerful individuals. I will admit that when I read these words, I recognized myself as the person who identified more with capitalism, the play of the free market, and even entrepreneurship. Not necessarily in a positive way, but through a glass darkly, focusing on fraud, speculative excess, and chicanery. Still, in rereading this passage, I began to contemplate an awkward question. Why had I not thrown my scholarly lot with labor? It was in attempting to grapple with that I came to the theme of this year's conference. And I want to answer that question that I had posed to myself with you in the room, training our attention on the long-neglected labor question, the fate and role of labor in the democratic capitalist economy. I'm afraid in addressing this, I cannot tell that story in a straight line, in the way we like to do it, with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Tonight we will become, as Kurt Vonnegut described his protagonist in Slaughterhouse-Five, unstuck in time, but we will end in the present. All right, my path to business history began in the 1990s. I wasn't a history major, actually, at all, not even close. And I nonetheless resolved, somewhat randomly at the time, to pursue a doctoral degree in the subject. And there was a problem with that. I didn't have any coursework to show that I actually could become a historian. So I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I went down to George Washington University and asked if there were any grad classes. And the first grad class that had an opening was entitled Business History. And it was taught by this man here, William Becker, former BHC president, who passed away a little over a year ago. Becker had been Albert Chandler's student, and surprise, surprise, the first book he assigned us to read was his doctoral advisor's masterwork, The Visible Hand. I wish Becker could be here tonight because his course and his book put me on the path to studying business history and standing here today. Anyway, applied to doctoral programs. I chose to attend NYU. Why? Because I wanted to live in New York City. But this posed a problem. This meant that I would have to find a roommate because my meager graduate fellowship was not going to cover rent. So my quest for a room led me to Brooklyn and led me to Park Slope, a neighborhood that is no longer remotely affordable. And I went to the Park Slope Food Co-op, and there was a little listing for a sublet. And I answered it, and I set up a time to meet this woman who was subleasing out a back area of the second floor of a row house on St. Mark's Avenue for the princely sum of $462.50. This was Lori Bell, my prospective roommate. She was much older than me. She was a self-described healer who possessed a truly astonishing collection of tinctures, herbal remedies, and other alternative cures. She worked with AIDS patients and intravenous drug addicts in a particularly unsavory area of Brooklyn. She was very different from me, and frankly, a little too quirky for my taste. But I needed a place to live, and so I signed a sublease and moved into the back floor of the second floor. Little did I know at that moment that my choice of roommates would inaugurate my education in labor history. You see, Lori's original name was Weinstone. She was Lori Weinstone, the daughter of one of the most prominent labor radicals of the 20th century, William Weinstone. He played a signal role in the Communist Party, as well as the larger labor movement of the interwar era. It was Weinstone, head of the Communist Party in Michigan, who helped orchestrate the sit-down strikes in Detroit that convulsed the auto industry in 1936, a key turning point in the history of labor in the United States. Weinstone, who was a prolific writer, his pamphlet was one of his publications, would later be featured both as a character in Reds, Warren Beatty's film, and also as a witness, an actual person interviewed in Reds in that time. So in these first few years of grad school, if you can imagine this, I would come home, I would listen to why I should take some remedy, but then she would tell me these stories about her father, particularly her family's fate during the McCarthy era, when Weinstone spent time in prison, having been prosecuted under the Smith Act. Here he is going off to the federal penitentiary, 1951. Lori would tell me these stories about being shadowed by FBI agents as her mother walked her to kindergarten. She would share other tales of a not-so-normal childhood. And whatever I thought of her father's dedication to the labor movement, there was no denying that his devotion had completely upended their lives. So too is the fact, interestingly, that he had a long-standing extramarital affair with the daughter of one of the most wealthiest industrialists in the Midwest. And she had two half-sisters from those unions. So, an amazing family. I found the stories unsettling, but I also found them deeply and wildly at odds with what I was encountering in graduate school. NYU had formidable strengths in labor history, social history, and I was force-fed a steady diet of that as a student. These inevitably emphasized the agency of ordinary workers, glorifying their struggle for better wages and working conditions in the fight against nefarious business owners. But honestly, these works left me cold. They seem completely at odds with the reality of the post-war era, beginning with the repression of the labor movement and the McCarthy era, much less what came afterward. The long, painful decline of the labor movement, courtesy of decades of deindustrialization, offshoring, declining union membership, and a Democratic Party that retreated from its historic connection to labor. There were no courses in business history in my program, and perhaps because I was incorrigibly contrarian by nature and still under the spell of the visible hand, I became increasingly drawn to labor's antagonists. I did so because I sensed that if you wanted to know about capitalism, you should know more about the capitalists, along with the financiers, the managers, and engineers who belong to business. This led me, perhaps inevitably, to the Hagley Museum and Library, where Roger Horowitz took pity on me. And when I showed up with a very ill-conceived dissertation topic that I quickly abandoned. But I did find a better one, closed the circle, received a Newcomen postdoctoral fellowship, and worked with Jeff Jones at Harvard Business School, and got my time in the place where Alfred Chandler had held court for many years. I belonged, in other words, to business history. Nonetheless, these are things that no one in this room knows, something was happening that had made me reconsider my relationship to the labor question. I had reconnected with my father's long-lost twin. Now, before you meet my family, which you will, I want you to contemplate the following thought experiment. Imagine for a moment that our society is plunged into chaos, not the current, like Last of Us fungal pandemic chaos, the end of the world chaos, dark ages. In all knowledge of the late 19th century, the United States is lost apart from one tattered copy of the visible hand. Right? Future monks transcribing it could be forgiven for concluding that the overriding challenge facing managers of large, complex corporations in the late 19th century was the question of how to build a bureaucracy staffed by rational managers who coordinate, quote, the flow of goods and services. Chandler's words, not mine. This would probably come as a surprise to the managers of those corporate combines. And the reason is, again and again, they confronted staggering, mind-blowing labor unrest. Here in 1873, their employees nursed incandescent rage against management, one that repeatedly broke into open violence, culminating in strikes like this one that left thousands of rail cars and locomotives burned, buildings destroyed, and the entire industrial edifice and economy shaken to its core. Chandler explained this way by claiming that labor didn't have a voice in management until the 1930s, because of those same strikes, actually, that Weinstein helped orchestrate. But before that time, labor was irrelevant to managed decisions, so there was really no need to include them in this story. And in any other book, this omission, frankly, would have been inconsequential. But Chandler's book, and his larger corpus of work, has had an outsized impact on our field. In fact, few fields can trace their origins so completely and unequivocally to one individual as we do. And there are many people in this room who can point their own interest in the subject to this one individual. And this is not restricted to scholars in the United States. Chandler's works effectively frame much of the study of business history outside the United States, even if it has evolved tremendously since those times. That has had, I would suggest, a kind of unintended effect of putting the labor question beyond the bounds of business history for the most part. And I'm not the first person to point this out. A few years after the publication of The Visible Hand, a testy exchange between Chandler and the sociologist Charles Perrow raised the question I am raising now. Where is labor, and what happens when you leave it out? Perrow wrote in disbelief that Chandler's book is remarkable in that he can intentionally treat the history of industrialization in the United States without dealing with the labor force, unquote. And this, Perrow argued, cast doubt on Chandler's central argument. What of the possibility, he inquired, that one of the drivers of vertical integration was the desire to secure a more docile, pliable workforce? Managers had every imaginable reason and motivation for doing so, given their workers' tendency to destroy the careful coordination mechanisms beloved by the managers. I asked myself, why did Chandler steer clear of labor? It might have something to do with his class position. Alfred DuPont Chandler, was the great-grandson of Henry Varnum Poor, who brought order to the chaos of railroad finances. Chandler began his academic career around the same time as the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which inaugurated a decades-long decline in the labor movement. And he came of age at a formative moment when the Consensus School of Historiography reigned dominant. These are all good explanations, really, and frankly, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Which raised the other question: why had I been so leery of labor? What was my excuse? At first glance, I should have a personal stake in the subject, because my father was born into a resolutely working-class family, one I know a great deal about. My grandfather, William Mihm, shown here with his wife, my grandmother, worked as a shipfitter at Cramp Shipyard in Philadelphia, a workplace that some of you may recognize as one of the few places where Taylorism was implemented at scale. Cramps was the basis of the working class existence of my father's family, and it was a large family, 5 boys. My father was the third. My father was unquestionably brilliant and showed very unusual signs, and the stories are they always appeal to me. The best one that I remember is that at one point his father, who was a pretty gruff individual, discovered his son had a special gift, and he took him down to show it off to his friends at the local tavern. He put my father was about 18 months, so he dropped him on the bar counter and, said, do your thing. And so my father fluently, perfectly recited the alphabet. And so that was a reasonable, precocious. And then my grandfather was like, and my father did it in reverse.
Oh, wow.
And the men were like, they couldn't do it. And so to be bested by a toddler, But despite his precociousness, it did not exempt him from work. He was put to work at age 4, delivering papers before school, until the police got wind of this, that my grandmother was engaging in a new, innovative form of child labor, and put a legal stop to it. All right? And it was around this time that my father's twin materialized. Not a real twin, but a boy born only a few months later than my father, whom the family took in as a foster child. This initial motivation and inclusion of this boy was crassly instrumental. The state of New Jersey would give the foster family money and, most importantly for my grandmother, multiple changes of clothes. And because the 2 boys were the same age and the same stature, she didn't have to buy my father any clothing, and they would just swap it back and forth. This boy was named Francis. My father's on the left, Francis is on the right. He had been born in a large Polish family, very large and extraordinarily poor, in the slums of Camden, New Jersey. I know a good deal about his family. I will not share that here. He had been given up for adoption, spent several years in foster care, before taking his place as my father's unofficial twin. They shared the same bedroom, attended the same school, same classes. But here the similarity ended. Where my father excelled in school, Francis struggled with what was likely dyslexia. The school held Francis back a grade. My grandmother told my father, you're going to have to stay back a grade. Francis did not make it to the next grade, and she did it again. My father took repeated grades twice with his brother. At this point, though, they gave up. The paths began to diverge. My father jumped ahead. Francis dropped out of school by 8th grade. My father, meanwhile, took a statewide examination to Rutgers University, got a full scholarship, and the 2 boys, who were side by side, began to follow very different tracks. He took this scholarship, one of only a handful of kids in South Jersey, and he began to shed his working class identity, moving from menial, dangerous labor to the life of the mine. And I sometimes think I have a very fatalistic view of life, I'm afraid. I might not be here given something that happened to him after his first year in college that is about labor. You see, because my grandfather had gotten badly hurt on the job at Cramps, slammed in the head with a piece of metal that forced an early retirement. The family moved to Cape May, New Jersey because there was work there. He could get work as a janitor, cleaning toilets and the bathhouses that catered to the tourists. And my father, who was a teenager now, joined him. In the summer of 1951, he was there working with the centrifuges that were used to dry the washed towels, gigantic machines that spun at high speeds. And my father, probably being an impulsive teenager, reached in before it was ready to end. And it took his arm and completely mangled it to pieces. It was broken in 17 different places, compound fractures. And my grandfather took my father to the local hospital, which was a very pathetic, small affair, presumably where he would have his arm amputated. This story resonates with me because it sort of highlights that our luck in life is sometimes very much driven by things outside of our control. And on this particular day, they brought my father in, and this nameless surgeon came up who was new. He had just arrived. And where had he come from? He had come from Korea, during the Korean War. He had been spending months patching men blown to pieces back together. And apparently, he looked at my father and just sort of said, yeah, I can fix that. 17 hours later, on the operating table, my father, you can see him here, star of the sea parish. That's his thing. Also, I want to point out, he liked movies and eating. Okay? So my father likes fun. There he is in his cast with my Italian aunt after that incident. These stories, though, as interesting as they may be, did not make me think that membership in the working class was something to treasure. It was a cross to be carried, not a badge of pride. It was something to avoid, escape, and transcend, and that feeling, I'm afraid, has likely informed my studious indifference to the labor question. Instead, I venerated my father, his meritocratic rise, the fact that he loved classical music, John Sibelius was his favorite composer, that he loved Melville and Conrad, that he married, successfully courted and married a brilliant young woman, a microbiologist, who had grown up in a comfortable middle-class family where college education was the norm. He would go on to pick up degrees in geology and physics, become an award-winning high school teacher, and eventually school administrator. He did not turn his back on his origins. It's interesting, he pioneered classes, science classes for high school students who were not going to college, which was a subtle, I think, recognition of his origins. And he began to climb up the socioeconomic ladder. Here he is getting an award for these classes. And it allowed him to have a family. My sister came first, and then in 1968, me. And this is the BHC, so you're going to see baby pictures. Okay? There we go. Right. This was 1968 that I was born, and I will do the math for you. I'm 56 years old. That means I'm old enough now to have a dawning awareness of the ways that the decades-long span of my own modest life maps on the kind of more sweeping historical changes measured in decades, not days. I can see now that I was born in the twilight of the American century, when the nation's manufacturing base began to move offshore, and many in the working class began to drift into the underclass. And yet, paradoxically, I was also born at the dawn of an entirely new economy. And once again, my father saw this coming before anyone else that we knew. In the 1960s, he began bringing computers into the classroom. He used DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, terminals to tap into mainframes at nearby Trinity College. And I have distinct memories of working on a DEC terminal hooked up to one of these mainframes on our rotary telephone. I also learned Boolean logic, and binary arithmetic before I learned the facts of life, which probably may account for my delayed romantic success. This is a DEC terminal, a deck terminal, and this, by the way, is my 7th grade science project, which I found in the barn, when I had built a binary adder, where you basic arithmetic, on using breadboards. The breadboard is this was the stuff that you would use. Those are AND gates, NAND gates, OR gates, NOR gates. These are the building blocks of all computers still today, made of transistors that allow zeros and ones off and on to serve as the basis of computation. In fact, my father left the classroom, became a computer programmer, joined the information economy. His brother, by contrast, kicked around in unskilled jobs, and then, thankfully, his older brother started a company, and he apprenticed as a machinist and learned to become a machinist. He was able to become a very skilled machinist despite his lack of ability to read. And in the 1970s, though, he became estranged from his brothers, and by extension, the rest of the family, and he quit and moved away. And that might have been the end of the matter, as the paths of Fran and my father diverged. But you know something? I have really fond memories of Fran. That's me and him. And as I grew older, I became increasingly likely, or increasingly liable to identify with him. And the reason is, I began having trouble in school. For reasons that remain unclear, I was unable to write, literally write, with a pencil. I was taken to experts, and this has given me a very healthy skepticism of experts, who declared that I was suffering from cognitive deficits, and I was told I would need to repeat 2nd grade. And indeed, I did repeat 2nd grade. And my parents were also told that I would need special assistance for the rest of my life, which may be true. That I would need to be yoked to a manuensis who would serve as my scribe. Now, needless to say, that didn't happen, but my experience being put in what were called derogatorily SPED classes, special education classes, repeating a grade, gave me a first-hand taste of what Francis had experienced. And yes, obviously I did make it to 3rd grade. But it began making me wonder, what had happened to him? How had he coped and adapted? And these questions remain unanswered until grad school, when I was traveling back and forth through New Jersey, passing close by where he lived, and I looked him up and asked if he would sit down and talk. And so we agreed to meet. And so began a friendship. I mean, I was his nephew, but it was really a friendship. I would visit him a few times a year, and call him on the phone. He really enjoyed getting to know my kids. There he is with his treasured tomato plants. And he lived in a very tiny house that he had afforded with wages working as a machinist at Garvey Industries in New Jersey, manufacturer of conveyor belts. As the years passed and we hung out, I became increasingly curious about his work as a machinist, in part because one of his hobbies in retirement had been to visit flea markets, buying up American-made drills and bits left behind when factories closed. And in fact, my scholarly obsession with screw threads, taps, and dies traces to these conversations. So too did my interest, clandestine as it may have been, in labor history. In fact, it was around this time that I became bothered more and more by the fact that the stories of business and labor continue to be told Severance style by entirely different groups of historians, each with what seemed to be oblivious, each of which seemed to be oblivious to the other, or worse, hostile, as if they were continuing the age-old struggle between capital and labor. In theory, the new history of capitalism should fix these flaws, and it aspired to use Louis Hyman's eloquent phrasing, and I'm pointing at Louis for now, to tell the history from below all the way to the top, which I have always loved as an amazing kind of summary. I think, though, that our field, and I think its capaciousness was both its strength, its kind of lack of definition, per se, was one of its strengths, and it allowed flourishing of scholarship, but much of the scholarship ended up going into buckets. Economics of slavery, history of finance, neoliberalism, but also, while there was some work on labor, I would not say it was overrepresented. And that's perhaps understandable if you think about these things. Workers in the United States had seen their power decline significantly over the last 50 years, and most of the scholars marching under this banner, myself included, have spent their lives watching labor's already fragile power erode. But something is worth noting has been happening lately that may or may not be something that's public knowledge. I know some people know it. Just as the new history of capitalism is flourishing, unions, oddly enough, have become increasingly popular. This is the disapproval rate of unions. Dramatic decline, cut in half. This is the approval rate. It gives you some sense of the trends of the last 10 to 15 years. What's striking, too, about this, now that 70% of Americans approve of unions, is that there's also anxiety and concern about the future of labor for people who never before felt it. I'm speaking of the knowledge workers, the laptop class, who have prospered over the last half century. In the last 2 years, the explosive growth of artificial intelligence has raised the specter, if not the reality, that higher order human cognition can be outsourced to a machine no more or less unceremoniously, and when weavers saw their looms replaced by mechanical looms. I sometimes wonder what my father would think of these developments. This is the NVIDIA Blackwell chip, one of the latest cutting-edge, next-generation chips. NVIDIA bills this as the, quote, engine of the new industrial revolution. Those logic gates I showed you on my 7th grade science projects require 2, 3, maybe 5 transistors. This chip has 80 billion transistors on it. You do the math, and while much of the coverage of AI is clouded by hype, these developments will almost certainly transform the nature of work, and by extension, business. I believe, I would like to venture, that both our current political moment, as well as looming changes in the nature of work, will draw historians' attention back to the labor question. And I believe business historians have a role to play in this undertaking. Revisiting earlier phases of automation and skilling, not in order to tell heroic stories of resistance, but to examine the role of business in driving those changes. The possibilities multiply from here. Business historians who take workers as a serious subject of inquiry can break the wall that has divided our field from labor history. We can and will, I hope, bring a new perspective on a range of subjects, many of them in evidence at this conference: strikes and strike-breaking, pensions, employee benefits, human resource departments, disability, forced labor, gender discrimination in wages, remote work, labor law, emotional labor, discriminatory hiring of all kinds, offshoring, and much more. But all of this means acknowledging that there is more to the history of business than the bloodless order-making decisions of managers, and that chaos and conflict, often quite violent, is central to the story. The purpose of this conference, for me at least, has been to highlight and encourage this kind of work, not only as a standalone, discrete set of inquiries, but as something larger and more coherent, a serious, sustained engagement by business history with the labor question, broadly defined. Time will tell whether we have succeeded. And for those of you still skeptical, perhaps, of the enterprise, I want to leave you with a final vignette. It will underscore why I did what I've done. Shortly before he died, my Uncle Franny, who had never, ever, in hundreds of conversations, expressed the slightest interest or knowledge of politics, told me over the phone that he had become a Trump supporter. It was at that moment, I remember this conversation very distinctly. And again, I'm not taking a side here, I'm just reporting this, but I remember thinking, like, the kind of rightward drift of the working class, which up until then had been a kind of vague and distant abstraction, suddenly became a very concrete, tangible reality. And it was at that moment, too, that I genuinely began to question my failure to consider labor. I had spent the last half-century capitalizing on my father's own gains, enjoying the privileges of an elite education and the connections that afforded. It was very easy and understandable at the time when I was younger to ascribe that to my own merit. Yet the fact is that my own trajectory rested, at least in part, on something very solid: my father's own exit from the working class, which is itself made possible by the simple fact that his father could earn enough as a shipfitter to provide for a family of 5. That world is gone. And no amount of pointless prattle about disruptive innovation, moving fast and breaking things that comes out of Silicon Valley and other quarters, none of that can banish that stubborn reality. The decline of economic opportunity for large swaths of workers in this country and others, I'm afraid, has brought us in part to this point. As a consequence, the labor question, largely missing from the national discourse for decades, has made a dramatic return. How then, I will ask you, as business historians, will you answer it? Thank you.